Welcome to those of you listening on News Radio 600 Cocoa. My name is Scott Lewis. This is the Voice of San Diego on podcast. I'm here with my friend Andrew Keatts.
What's up, buddy?
How are you?
Great.
Sara, Libby.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
We've got a great show today. We are going to be talking about the big transformation of San Diego politics and one particular thread of that we've been tracking for a while in pieces, literally for years in pieces. So let's see if we can pull all the pieces together. You two have both been doing some interviews today for our special elections podcast. We don't have a special guest, but we were working on some. Sara, you talked to Mike Levin, huh?
I did.
Running for Congress.
That's what he's running for.
That is what he's running for. And how'd that go?
Good. He's feisty. He's fired up.
Yeah, he's a very polished speaker.
Very polished. He had a way of redirecting questions to exactly what he wanted to say, which is a good skill in a politician, I suppose.
And a baseball player.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that they are very good at just answering the question with the same response for everything?
I haven't.
Oh.
It's a skill I really wish I had. When I do interviews, I'm just like, I don't know the answer to that.
I'm like, well, I guess I'm duty bound to answer your exact question on your terms.
I started getting good. And then the problem with that is that then you start to say, well, I can do an interview on anything because I don't actually have to talk about anything that they're asking me. It's
I haven't
freeing.
mastered that. I'm like,
freeing.
I haven't written 10 policy papers on that, so clearly I'm not your woman.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was on KPBS one year. And it was the round table, and Gloria Penner used to have us on, and there'd be like, I was there for like some local politics issue, and she turns to me and she's like, what are we going to do about the nuclear threat from North Korea? And I was like, well, we need to abate it.
Sure.
I don't know, man. And I remember being like really stuck on it. And then Tony Perry's like, dude, you just need to just say something one thing that you sound smart at. It doesn't matter if it's even relevant to what she's asked. And I was like, oh,
I just fundamentally don't have that skill.
We also, you talked to Jen Campbell, Dr. Jen Campbell, running for city council.
I did. And a week ago, I talked to Vivian Moreno, who's running for city council as well. So we will, at a certain point, we will be editing and putting these together in episode form.
Yes. We also support the First Amendment.
I do, personally.
Something I'm into as a citizen. It's not just for the
good.
press, it's for all of us. All individuals.
True.
Got to talk.
It's good.
And editorial boards.
A lot of editorial boards. They do not speak for the newsroom, though. We cannot say that the newspapers support that. They might be objective as far as like pro-con about the First Amendment. We don't know because they do not speak for those.
The newsrooms of America are officially apathetic to the question of the First Amendment. They're undecided.
There's a lot of points on both sides.
No, there you are. They will dutifully record the opinions of other people on the question of the Fourth Amendment.
First Amendment.
Excuse me.
Well, both.
Fourth.
Any
amendment.
Should we tell people what we're even talking about?
Sorry, yes, 350 editorial boards of newspapers across the country, plus a bunch of other, including alternate news sources and others, all published editorials championing their support of the First Amendment and Donald Trump, and really their concern about the rhetoric coming from the President of the United States and his attacks about fake news and journalists being the enemy of people. They're saying clearly that they are not the enemy of the people. So we didn't participate in it. It's not because we took a big stand saying like, well, we don't want to be part of groupthink or anything like the LA Times did. We just didn't talk about it. But we don't
have an editorial board, so that makes it
exactly
easy.
We don't have a mechanism for sort of all agreeing on something, which seems like if you're going to say that your paper agrees with something, you should have a mechanism that everybody gets involved to make that decision.
I just feel like
just eliminate it.
I don't need to get into the are editorial boards good or bad. I'm of the position that they're good, and yet I don't know. This is kind of meh. I feel like if you're in the position of like arguing that your very existence is fine, then you're kind of losing. We don't like need joint editorials on like murder is bad, because that means we're like maybe entertaining the position that murder's good.
Or we're not murderers.
Yeah.
We're not the enemy of the people was the kind of the stance that a lot of people were taking. And it's like even engaging that debate feels like a loss. Like,
right, exactly.
Considering that it's a he said, she said kind of thing. Like, it's not. It's, on the other hand, I'm undecided. I think it's good to see all the papers rally and try to make a point. And, it's an important point to articulate that we take for granted that people may not always be exposed to. On the other hand, yeah, it didn't hit the right chord, and I still can't figure out why. And it's not the reason the LA Times editorial board came out and said we should never unite on anything. It's just groupthink, and it makes everybody think we're all in collusion together, which is dumb. Like,
yeah, that's stupid.
If it's worth, we join forces with other newspapers all the time to make certain points in court and other things like that.
I think writing, I agree with them, but I think writing that in an editorial is also dumb. It's just really hard for me to imagine an editorial opinion that I think has a purpose.
Okay.
I've never read one, and I don't think.
I think that's insane. I mean, I think editorial boards are at their most powerful when they're, speaking up for the vulnerable and against policies that actually are controversial. And so, like, editorial boards made me want to be a journalist. And one of the most powerful ones that I've mentioned before is the New York Times taking a stand against stop and frisk, which at one point was controversial. It's far less controversial now. And more recently against
the stand against it is far less controversial. Yeah.
Yeah. And more recently, their editorial boards writing on family separations, I think, has been really powerful. And I think those are the kinds of things that those boards do at their best, as opposed to just like, hey, I'm nice and good, don't hate me.
Yeah.
Which, like, you're preaching to the choir if you're already reading a newspaper editorial.
That's a good point.
I think that's the issue I have with them. I don't know what they're for. I don't know what they're for.
I think that there's
I don't think anyone goes there to get their opinion changed. I don't think they reach an audience that is persuadable in the first place. I just can't ever imagine a scenario in which any person has had an opinion changed by an editorial board,
well, I think
that they've shifted a conversation.
That's the wrong framing, because not everybody's going in there armed with heavily fortified opinions on certain things. Like sometimes, especially in local issues, they might articulate, pull together all the different arguments about, like, say, sand egg. Like, if we had an editorial board pretty regularly clarifying what sand egg was doing that was wrong, how they need to deal with it better. Mm-hmm. It's not like the vast majority of readers are approaching that topic with heavily fortified opinions on that we're trying to change. It's thought leadership where you're setting the structure for how that can go. And I have seen scandals in this town, or decisions in this town. The UT's editorial board used to be extremely influential on a lot of discussions in town. Their arguments and the framing of them would carry through to all kinds of public discussions. And so I do think there is a place in journalism for people to stitch together conclusions based on what the reporting has found, that someday maybe we'll find our outlet with that. But I do understand that. Obviously I have my own criticism about the structure and presentation of editorial boards, for sure.
Yeah, I think you're more likely to be swayed on something that you know very little about. Am I going to go to an editorial board and have my mind changed about who to vote for president? Almost certainly not. But state superintendent or board of equalization, or things that people are coming into with very little information, those are really helpful, I think, to people.
Right. Well, speaking of elections, there is a lot changing in San Diego. When I started reporting here 15 years ago, it was one type of place. And just like a child growing up, it's hard to see how much has changed every day. But when you look back and you compare the two of what San Diego was like then and what San Diego is like now, it's incredibly different. And this has been kind of a slow creep, but there's also been lurches. And it's a demographic and a political shift, right? So, city councils are changing, unions are changing. People themselves are changing. Party registration in the county is changing. We've talked about the Metropolitan Transit System, SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments, National City, Civic San Diego. These organizations and agencies are all changing. They're getting more diverse, more democratic as far as Big D, Democratic Party, right? Mm-hmm. So one thread of this has been kind of engineered as well and has gone through lurches, and that is election reform. So let's dial back. I believe it was 2015. On this particular podcast, the Todd Gloria, the assemblyman, at that time was city councilman, he started presenting and rolling out the idea of changing the way San Diego, the city of San Diego, would do elections. So, for instance, back several years ago, if you were running for city council and you got more than 50% of the vote in the primary election, you won that seat outright.
Yeah, so Councilmember Lori Zaff in 2014 ran for re-election. She had a viable competitor in Sara Boot, but she won by more. She got more than 50% of the vote. She won in June.
Right.
Never went to November.
Scott Sherman, same thing, won in primary. He's in a very contested race in that district, barely won the primary, but he won it with more than 50% of the vote, won outright, did not have to face the November elections. Now, the Democrats and some labor unions didn't like that. On the one side, they have a principle where they say that's a primary election. You shouldn't communicate that you should better communicate that a primary election is actually a final election if it's going to make that decision outright that time. And if it's a primary election, then it should lead to definitely a runoff election. But they also have more self-interest involved in the sense that more people do vote in November. And so if they could get those races to November, they know that most of those more people are Democrats or would vote
more likely to be Democrats, yeah.
And thus would better help their candidates. So if that race in Scott Sherman's district, for example, had gone to a runoff, Barack Obama was on the ballot, like that pretty clearly would have had a very good opportunity to get the Democrat in that seat.
Yeah, there's a trickle-down effect as well, which is that you cannot it becomes more difficult to recruit competitive candidates if they know the election will be decided in June. So there's a certain amount of it that we can describe based on what's happened, the Lori Zaff or Scott Sherman examples. The other part of it is sort of a what-if scenario, which is, for instance, when Mayor Faulkner ran for re-election in 2016, and I do think this was a very influential one in sort of pushing this movement forward, it was pretty clear that election was probably going to be decided in June. And so all of the politicians who might have been able to give Mayor Faulkner a real run for his money in that re-election fight had to decide whether they'd be able to do it in June. And it was one more thing that might have influenced them to run for another office instead.
Mm-hmm. So they put forward Measure K, right? So Measure K was put forward. It was put on the ballot by the city council. Basically, the discussion was, again, this full voter participation, this idea that we need to make sure that all races go to a runoff. So we had a big debate. We had it at PolitiFest. A lot of people talked about it. There wasn't this huge spending about it that we thought might come. We thought there'd be kind of this big war of interest because the Republicans would see what was at stake and dump a bunch of money in it. The Democrats would also. Turned out the Republicans kind of sat it out.
It was kind of a pump fake. What they put a bunch of money into an account and then didn't spend it.
Right.
Almost forcing Democrats to actually spend it in the concern that maybe Republicans would, and therefore get money spent there that might otherwise be spent in candidate elections.
So Measure K becomes law. 2016, the election. You might remember the 2016 election.
Yeah, this was the most influential thing that took place that day.
Yeah, there was a lot of
that
things.
And the city attorney race.
City attorney race,
and the Chargers too. Yeah.
Sure.
So now all these eyes turn to the county. They want to do the same thing at the county. This county has a lot of these same sort of situations. We just saw this year the sheriff, the assessor, the district attorney all get elected with more than 50% of the vote in the primary. Democrats want this to change, and they've got to do that. At the county, they decide. But at the county's set up in a way that it's unclear whether a ballot measure can make the change in the same way that the city did, right? So they decide they need legislation first. And I remember when Todd Gloria, the assemblyman who took this up, started pushing this through, it was confusing to even me. I thought he was pushing through the actual change.
Right.
But what he was just doing was putting through the option to change.
Yeah, and this was something that came up in the discussion about the bill is they were kind of discussing the merits of this proposal in the legislature, and he would always say, well, the voters are the ones who are actually going to decide. We're not deciding this today. All we're deciding is whether we should let voters weigh in.
Right. So here was Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, who got a little bit more candid about what they were trying to achieve when she was speaking in front of her colleagues at the legislature about why they needed to support this.
A majority of the residents in San Diego County are Democrats, and yet we don't hold a single supervisor seat. There have been long-standing ways in which the county power has replicated itself. I'm very honest about why we're doing this. We had to actually institute term limits. Democrats instituted term limits on Republicans just to be able to have a fair shot. They've drawn their own districts for years behind closed doors. They've ensured that they continue to hold power over and over again. Sometimes in a charter county, you have to allow for fairness. We know that 5 supervisors in San Diego, all white, all Republican, are not representative of the demographic that votes in majority elections in November. It's time to change that, and I'm sorry that we have to do it in a way that includes the state, but the voters in San Diego County will ultimately make this decision. The same way they did last November in the city election, in which they overwhelmingly decided that the November electorate, where the most people vote, where democracy is at its fullest, should have the biggest voice. I'm not sure why the other side is so scared of full democracy, but I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
She got it. She got that aye vote. It passed. So they started collecting signatures. The largest county employees union, SEIU, led the charge for the full voter participation cause, and others, including the Center for Policy Initiatives and others, gathered together. This was a major cause, and they collected signatures, and they turned them in.
Correct.
So everybody was waiting. This was going to be a big change. Then they got a memo from Michael Vu, the Registrar of Voters. And he said, you got a lot of signatures, but I was looking at this law that you passed, and the law says you need 10% of all the voters in the county to sign something like this to get it on the ballot.
That's a lot of voters.
And that's this number. And you actually turned in this number, which is a lot less than that number. And thus, you don't have enough signatures to make it on the ballot yet.
Right.
And so the question goes back to Sacramento, essentially, in a rushed fashion.
Yeah, because their argument was, oh, that's just a mistake. And you're reading that really wrongly.
Yeah. Or closely.
Yeah, but so on the one hand, they were kind of attacking him, like, you're reading that in a way that benefits Republicans.
Right.
But also, maybe we should get that clarified at the state. So Todd Gloria, again, goes to the state colleagues that he has and asks them for a rushed vote to get through a change, a clarification. And they stuck this into a bill about a lot of different things.
Yeah, so this was a budget trailer bill. It wasn't like its own separate bill the way it was the first time that was just about this county election thing. This was a budget bill. So it was ostensibly about how the state will fund things, but...
A budget bill not about County of San Diego elections.
Exactly.
So they get their clarification through, which says, no. We didn't mean that 10% of all voters should have to sign something like this to get on the ballot. We meant 10% of all people who voted in the last election.
Right. Much lower threshold.
And so at this point, now open up a series of fights happening more or less concurrently. The registrar goes back to work looking at the signatures, and ultimately, based on this new legislation, certifies that there are, in fact, enough signatures, putting the question to the Board of Supervisors.
The Board of Supervisors are facing a deadline to put things on the ballot, August 10th, just like everybody else.
So the County Board of Supervisors now has three options. They can put it on the ballot, they can adopt it outright, or they can do an impact study on the question, which is going to take 30 days. That is ultimately the thing that they decided to do. And it's important because that 30-day period wasn't going to expire until after the deadline to get the question on the ballot for November of 2018. If the study came back after the deadline, this Board of Supervisors would then be pressed with one of two options, either adopt it outright or put it on the ballot. But putting it on the ballot at that point would mean making the decision, voters would make a decision in 2020, not 2018.
And that would be a big deal because that would mean that the 2020 elections for county supervisor or whatever would not be affected by this new law, which would have significant political consequences for them. All right, to find out what happens next, stay tuned. We're going to get through our break and talk about the people and things that support Voice San Diego, make this happen. And when we come back, we'll finish how this tale came about and explain its significance because it's probably one of the biggest things on the November ballot. This has been Voice of San Diego in partnership with our friends and colleagues at News Radio 600 Koga.
Voice of San Diego podcasts are sponsored in part by a proud supporter of Monarch School and Make-A-Wish San Diego. As a nonprofit news organization, we depend on our members, foundations, and sponsors to provide funding to support the investigative journalism you expect from us. We are very grateful for all of our supporters, and we will recognize them during the show. Make-A-Wish San Diego grants wishes to children with critical illnesses in San Diego and Imperial counties. Visit sandiego.wish.org to find out how you can help make wishes come true. And Monarch School has served San Diego for nearly 3 decades, beginning as a one-room education center and expanding into a K-12 comprehensive school designed to educate homeless youth. To find out more or to get involved, visit monarchschools.org. If you like Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor too, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
We are back. All right, Andy, where we left off was this discussion about the county supervisors starting to test their own power and the limits of the laws to make sure they protect their interests in these elections as far as the kinds of things they care about. And so they decide to push this off, but that gets challenged.
Yeah, and if you listen to the section we just played from Lorna Gonzalez, what she's talking about is not time sensitive. It's an evergreen sentiment about the importance of changing these elections and the way they operate. But delaying the measure to appear until 2020 has a very, very specific set of consequences. So, for instance, it wouldn't matter at all for the county-wide races that we vote on because they're not up again until 2022. Mm-hmm. So if this doesn't appear on the ballot until 2020 and it got approved, those changes would still be in effect for the district attorney, for the sheriff, for the county assessor, for the tax collector. There is one race and only one race that hinges on whether this decision is made in 2018 or 2020, but that one race could be the race that determines control of the County Board of Supervisors. So, right now, the County Board of Supervisors is controlled by 5 Republicans. In the fall, there seems to be a very good chance that former Assemblyman Nathan Fletcher could win his race against former District Attorney Bonnie DeMonis to take one of those seats. If that were to happen, it's not a foregone conclusion, but if that would have happened, that would give the Democrats 1 out of 5 seats. Also in 2020, City Councilman David Alvarez is running for county supervisor. That seat in the South Bay, where Greg Cox is now and has been for years, is heavily Democratic, and City Councilman David Alvarez will go into that against whatever Republican he runs against as an odds-on favorite. Again, not a foregone conclusion, but he has a very good chance to win. That would give the Democrats 2 seats. It's a 5-seat board, so they just need a 3rd seat to take control. That 3rd seat is also up in 2020. That's the current board chair, Kristen Gaspar's seat. It is the mid coast region, I guess I would call it. It's the
Encinitas,
Carlsbad, portions of Carlsbad, Carmel Valley. And it has been held by a Democrat before. When Kristen Gaspar won in 2016, she defeated a Democrat. And so it is the seat that is designed to essentially be a swing seat. The registration advantage is pretty close. A Democrat has won before, a Republican has won before. So her seat that election will ultimately have a good chance of determining which party is in control of the County Board of Supervisors. Since she's up in 2020, they need to have this change passed in 2018 to give themselves the best shot at knocking her off. If she's up for re-election in June, she's got a much better chance of winning.
And let's be clear, they are aiming for that.
Yeah,
there's no question that somebody's going to challenge her and that it's going to be fierce.
Yeah.
They were really buoyed by her decision to embrace Trump and some of these immigration issues so much because they felt like that was a divisive enough issue that she might be hurt by.
Yeah, I think they're really itching to throw that back at her and see how voters react.
Right. And so it's still hard to throw an incumbent out. There's no question. I would still give her, I think, a slight advantage, but maybe the demographics of the November vote would make a huge difference. And that's why this is so important. If she can win outright in June, that's going to be a much easier race for her than to try to go in a November runoff where Trump is on the ballot and there's a lot of things sort of stewing. Right?
Yeah. So the upshot is whatever big picture principles are at stake in this standoff, the timing aspect of it matters only for Kristen Gaspar's reelection, which Democrats think is going to determine control of the County Board of Supervisors. But then that's why it matters.
Then there's a lawsuit.
So
Tony Kravarik makes this point that he's the head of the Republican Party, this single vote thing, and it looks like it's in danger, right? The single subject thing. And it goes to the judge, and the judge actually makes a tentative ruling where he says, you've got a good point. I'm probably going to go with you, but it's a tentative ruling.
Yeah. So after there's a tentative ruling, both parties still have a chance to make their case in front of the judge and try and change his mind.
Sets the stage. Right.
Yeah.
So they have this argument, and the judge says, well, you made a good point, but this is going on the ballot. And he demands that the registrar put it on the ballot.
Right. So now it is on the ballot right now. It is now a measure that you'll be voting on in November, lest something else changes.
But
in fact, something else could change.
But just to be clear, we get yet another law. That goes to Sacramento. They want to be sure that if these guys appeal this verdict that Judge Stinn, by the way, he's the same judge that is in our case.
I saw that.
The public records case against San Diego Unified School District.
Hi, Judge.
Hi, Judge. He
great rulings. Every single ruling you've ever done. It's been fantastic. Great rulings.
We were a little conflicted on this one. So if that is appealed, then maybe it's in danger, and maybe this whole vote's in danger. So there's yet another bill going through the assembly now, and it is to clarify that it's its own bill and not all these other subjects, that single subject worry that they had. It's just its own bill. And it got a hearing at, what was it, a budget committee?
Yeah, so it's clarifying the original budget bill. It's all very complicated, but there's a change before the budget committee that says, we're going to head off this lawsuit. Whatever they're arguing, we're right.
Yeah, it specifically names them. It's like there is a lawsuit by these people. It alleges this. And to be clear, that is not right. What is right is what we're saying here. And that's the law.
And that's state law.
Yeah. So you can see this thing
very
is
important to all Californians.
Yeah. We're just getting this thing patched together every step of the way. I mean, it's a fascinating political science study of power grabs through the rule of law, right? Like nobody's really breaking the law or ethics, but all sides are going as far as they can to get more power, to preserve power.
Yeah, and I think the fascinating point about that is that if you compare it to the process that the city went through, we held public debates at PolitiFest, and it was all like this big high-minded debate about participation and like largely on the merits. And this is all like backroom policy dealing through lawsuits and assembly committees and supervisor meetings. Like these are all
gamesmanship.
It's all procedural gamesmanship that like the public has virtually no way of understanding or following or even knowing that it's happening unless you're like nerds like us who sit in a room and follow it all day.
Yeah, I was making that point at Andy's thing where he was awarded like complexity is a form of elitism. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is where like you have to be an elite person who's directly involved in this stuff in order to understand it. And brought that up at your thing because you're particularly good at breaking it down for people and helping people understand that and giving them avenues to understand that, because this is
I mean, we, as you can tell from this podcast, like there are pieces of this that we find still hard to understand, like what is in a budget trailer bill and what the rules are regarding those. These are all really complex procedures that we're talking about.
Well, the Republicans have had it.
Yeah.
And on the Assembly, we have Jay.
This is yesterday. This is just yesterday. So there's a lot of preamble to get you to our present day.
So Jay Obernolte, is that his?
Yeah, Obernolte.
He is from San Bernardino, and he had something to say.
You might ask yourself, why is this a budget bill? And I submit the only reason why it's being proposed as a budget bill is that that's the only way that we can apply this change with immediate effect without a 2/3 vote of the legislature as the Constitution requires. So, I think this is a deplorable interference in a local election. I'm kind of ashamed that we're doing it. It's exactly this kind of action that erodes our constituents' faith and trust in the integrity of their state government.
It's pretty fiery
for
a budget committee hearing.
Yeah, things are getting a little tense. Rocky Chavez was there, and he's from the San Diego area. He was flabbergasted. He even gave a shout out. He's like, I hope the podcasters are listening.
And we know why the reason we're doing this, because there are leaders within this assembly who come from San Diego, and they are able to push these things through. And this is wrong. If this is such an important thing, we should have been doing it through the committee. But to use our money to influence local politics because we can is wrong. And I'll be strongly voting no about this. I hope the press is watching this. I hope Dan Walters from Cal Matters. I hope the podcast that comes on in CalWorks, what's going on in Sacramento. Everybody speak up and says, you know what? In the budget process in Sacramento, we overstated our position, and this is the clearest example of abuse of power by the leadership of this assembly.
I'm just going to assume he's talking about us.
I choose to believe he was talking about us. I'll give Dan Walters a call, let him know Rocky wants him to listen in.
Yeah. So I did talk to Nick Serrano, spokesman for Assemblyman Gloria. He said, we added this to be, we won in court, and even after winning in court, we were concerned if anything else comes about, we want to be doubly sure that we're just clarifying our original intent back in that first bill, that the reason we're doing this is that at the first place was the same as we've always said, which is to get this on the ballot with the same amount of signatures as always. And this is just the second time we've had to do that.
The third time, though, really, right? Third time clarifying the law, because the first time was to clarify that they could do it, even though they weren't quite sure that they even needed it. It's just like, let's do it to be sure.
Yeah.
And they clarify it because
of the signatures.
They made a mistake and they didn't get enough signatures. And then they clarify it now just to be totally sure.
Yeah.
Totally sure.
So imagine if voters just vote no.
Yeah.
After all this. So there's one more crazy piece of procedural things here. So the County Board of Supervisors, in addition to the delaying things with this impact study, Supervisor Diane Jacob also put out her own election reform measure, and it was, it looked a lot like the reform measure that Todd Gloria has put forward, but it's different in an important way. So what it says is if there are only 2 people running in any election, then there's no need to have the primary. They just skip right to the general. But if there's any more than 2 and you get more than 50%, then you can win outright. Well,
which is like the whole point of the Todd Gloria bill.
Yeah. And I mean, you would just, if you were in that position that you were the one who was favored to win outright in June and there's only 2 people running, you'd just get another candidate to run. And then there'd be 3, so then you could win, right?
Yeah, didn't they ask the judge to stick that one on the ballot
They
too?
asked the judge to stick that one on the ballot too, and he said no, which means, assuming the County Board of Supervisors goes forward after that impact study, because their impact study actually was for both measures. So when that one comes back, assuming that she's still interested in this measure and her colleagues support her, they'll be able to put it on a ballot, but they won't be able to put it on a ballot until 2020, it is in the realm of possibility that voters could approve this measure in November. It will be in place for 2020. Those elections will take place in 2020 under that set of rules, but also in 2020, they will vote on Supervisor Diane Jacobs' measure. And if they approve that one, then that would be in place for 2022, which would mean they'd have an opportunity to take over the County Board of Supervisors. But by 2022, when all the county-wide races are up for re-election again,
it could be a whole other set of rules in place.
A third set of rules in place, yes.
So, bottom line.
So this is the right way to do this. This is clearly the sane and comprehensible.
Everything's going according to plan on all sides.
Yeah. This is the way you change the rules in an orderly fashion.
The bottom line is this year on the ballot for all County of San Diego residents will be a decision. Do you want to change the way that county elected offices are elected, where the primaries literally set up a runoff no matter what, and all things go to a runoff in November?
Yeah.
And so
if Measure K teaches us anything, it seems to be the type of thing that sounds good to voters on the ballot, because the Measure K won overwhelmingly.
It's a different electorate.
Yeah, it's a more conservative group.
It is, but I guess the question is, would you know that this was benefit liberals by reading it on the ballot?
No, you won't. That'll be the decision of the campaigns about how much they want to spend to make that association. Democrats trying to steal whatever, like that kind of thing is going to be, are they going to spend $1 million doing that?
Right.
So that's what to watch for. We tried to break it down but it's also, it's part of a whole thing about how we do elections in San Diego and how they're changing things. And, on another similar point, we watched the San Diego Unified School District sort of deal with a similar type of thing where if we're talking about consistency across agencies, one of the things that's inconsistent is all of these different governments right now elect their city council members or whatever through district elections. So none of the city council members, for example, in the city of San Diego have to appeal to the whole city in a campaign. They get their own neighborhood group to do the votes, right? San Diego Unified is set up where each of the 5 trustees are elected first in their primary. They have to appeal to their sub-district, their neighborhood area.
Yeah, that's how they select for a runoff.
Right. So the top 2 people in the primary in that neighborhood area become the 2 finalists who go to a runoff. But the runoff is for the whole city, for the whole district. And so you have to appeal to the whole district, which is it's almost the whole city of San Diego. It's a big area. And so that at-large race. And so a lot of the Republicans say, look, if we're trying to make things consistent, why don't you make that consistent with these things, with these other agencies?
Virtually every other race.
Right.
You don't run across the whole state when you're running for assembly. You just run in that district. You don't run across the whole United States when you're running for Congress. You just run in that district. It's really outside the norm of how we elect virtually every other office.
And there's a lawyer who is suing many smaller cities around the state on the basis that their elected body is not representative of their city because they don't have district-specific elections.
Right.
So it's often a way to empower certain communities that might be concentrated in one certain area, so that in a city like Escondido that has a sizable Latino population, you do not have an all-white body.
But there we saw a different kind of power struggle play out using these same sort of procedural and sort of muscle whatever leverage you have over certain political decisions over what to put forward on the ballot and what not to. And the San Diego Unified School District said, well, we're not ready to make that change. We don't want to make that change. And various interests pressured the city council members not to put that kind of change on the ballot, and they didn't.
Yeah.
So
even then, there's a grand jury report saying this is bad, you should change it.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't.
And there was a committee.
Fell on deaf ears.
The district had put out a committee saying, we're going to study this and going to talk to everybody in the community. And it came back, and they were interested in making the change and found that the school constituents were interested in that sort of change, and it didn't go forward. So that's how this stuff goes. It's all about power, and things are changing in San Diego. All right, our hero of the week.
After 11 years on the job, City Auditor Eduardo Luna tendered his resignation, saying he would be taking a similar position with the City of Beverly Hills. That's according to the UT. So the auditor position, just for those who might be new to town, was created in the wake of the financial crisis in 2009 when the city's finances were just absolutely wrecked. This was one of the recommendations to have an independent city auditor. Luna was the first person to take that job. And so over the years, Luna has conducted a number of audits. We've always, maybe not always, but we have often covered them when they found, particularly important things. Some of those have included weaknesses in the development system that could have potentially allowed employees to commit fraud without detection. He found one thing I wrote about a couple years ago was architects who shouldn't have qualified for a program where development projects could be fast-tracked. People who didn't qualify benefited anyway, including some people with ties to the mayor. The city's business subsidy program had not created meaningful benchmarks, and benefits were rarely going to poor communities. He most recently, he just identified that the city's water department sent thousands of incorrect water bills to residents last year. City Councilwoman Lori Zaff, who chairs the city's audit committee, said the search for a new auditor was already underway, and that the city charter allows only a one 10-year term for an auditor.
So, yeah, a lot of that is expected of an auditor.
It's what you do.
It's what you do.
You look at programs.
But it's nice to have one that worked, and this was the first one we'd had in that new form of government, and who reported essentially to an audit committee. And I thought he set a good precedent.
Yeah, hell of a mustache too.
Yeah, solid mustache. All right, our goat of the week.
You lose. Good day, sir.
All right, this is we're going to give this to CBS 8, News 8. And reporter David Gottfredson, so there was this story that came out. It was about this situation in National City that a lot of us have been following, the death of Earl McNeil in the hands of police custody. We're unsure, what happened. He called for help. We're unsure what happened after that, and he died in their custody. And there's a lot of videos and such, and there was this story that came out on News 8 under the byline Unknown Reporter. And it was like this anonymous thing. And it was very one-sided. It was interviewing the National City Police Chief. It had a lot of things like, you can't sugarcoat the criminal history of this man, Earl McNeil. Now, he wasn't pulled in there for criminal actions. He had called for help. So there was a lot of people online like, what is this? Why is this byline anonymous? What is this situation?
It wasn't even just like byline anonymous. It was like a branded thing, Unknown Reporter.
Yeah, and so it caught a lot of people off guard. It also, because it had this sort of pro, defense of the police department angle, it felt really strange to not have the reporter's name on it.
Yeah, so there's kind of two separate issues, which is the weird unknown reporter thing, and then the content of the story itself, which, we've seen a lot of stories across the nation sort of blame particularly black men who die at the hands of police for their own deaths. We saw it with Trayvon Martin when it was like, well, he'd been smoking pot a lot. You know, he was a bad kid. Like, he was not responsible for being killed in cold blood. And that was sort of an issue here, running down his criminal history that had nothing to do with the way he died. And so it was a case where it was particularly important to have a reporter who's accountable to that story.
Mm-hmm. So they, at least to their credit, they did acknowledge that this was David Gottfredson. They changed the online presentation of it, and they said, he said, "I'm not an on-air reporter. We were exploring the moniker as a franchise." They pointed out that they had done this before on a short-term vacation rental story. And then they said they changed it. They updated the byline. They updated it with more video clips from the interview with the police chief. So look, it's just one of these things. Like if we were talking earlier about press and trust, and you don't build trust with anonymous reports like this, and this sort of weird way of going about it. You do by apologizing, becoming clear with it. So hopefully that was a first step to making that.
Also, just get rid of the unknown reporter idea.
Yeah,
retire
that's
that.
Never, an odd brand.
Under no circumstances is that a good idea.
The idea of a anonymous reporter. I mean, there's undercover reports, but
then you
that's
put your
still
name
a
on it at the end. Yeah,
it's weird. So, all right. Well, that's us trying to explain how these things work and how we go through all these interviews and spend a lot of time trying to understand things so that we can explain them out to everybody. And that is what journalists are doing on your behalf across the country. And so, yes, indeed, we support the First Amendment in their effort to do that. And if you support what we do at Voice of San Diego, you should consider donating. voiceofsandiego.org/donate.
You're listening to the Voice of San Diego Podcast Network. Visit voiceofsandiego.org/podcast to learn more about the rest of the shows in our network. We've got Cura Chaos, a live podcast featuring interviews with movers and shakers from San Diego and Baja California, and The Kept Faith, a sports podcast. Be sure to give them a try, and thanks for listening.